Welcome everyone to the first SAD seminar of the year. Spatial Analytics and Data is back, and launching us for a year of fantastic programming is Michael Widener, who is a Canada Research Chair in Transportation and Health at the University of Toronto, where he also serves as the Director of Health Studies at University College and as an Associate Professor in Geography and Planning. He also has a cross-appointment in Epidemiology. Dr. Widener is a health geographer whose research focuses on how public health affects and is affected by movement and transportation systems. His primary project at the moment is an exploration of how time pressure, transportation options, and divisions of household labor impact access to food and dietary behaviors. Outside of Toronto, Dr. Widener serves on various journal editorial boards, is a member of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research College of Reviewers, co-leads the Social and Health Factors cluster of the Network of European Communication and Transportation Activity Researchers, that was a mouthful, and co-chairs the Prioritizing Populations theme of the Mobilizing Justice Partnership. We are delighted to have you with us today, Michael. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Just one quick note to our audience members that we will be using the Q&A functionality on the Zoom webinar. If you're not familiar with it, it's down at the bottom of the screen. And if you can just drop your questions or comments for Dr. Widener, then we'll pick those up in the Q&A portion of the seminar after the talk. Thanks, everyone. The floor is yours, Michael.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Levi, for having me and asking me to join this seminar series. I know it's been a big success over the last year or so, so it was really an honor to be asked to be SAD with you. And so with that, I'll get started with my talk. It's good to see some familiar faces in the attendees list here. I only wish that I'd be able to say hi in person, but maybe at AAG in New York, we'll be able to catch up, unless I embarrass myself too deeply here, in which case I'll be hiding in my hotel. So let's start. Hopefully my screen is successfully shared. Okay, we're good. Cool. So today I'm going to be giving a talk about some of the work that I've been doing with colleagues and my students and postdoc around using paired time use and GPS trajectory data to understand a number of different behavioral factors in the city of Toronto. And so we'll touch on food environments, we'll touch a bit on household labor, and of course, food-related labor is related to food environments. And I'll provide a little bit of a teaser for some of the work we're doing around care and caring using the same data set. But I was I was introduced very adequately, so I will not reintroduce myself, but I will just quickly note that both Lindsay Smith and Bochu Liu, a postdoc and PhD student in my group respectively, were big parts in making this work happen. And I want to give a shout out to them at the front. And I'll also note that both of them are on the job market. So if you have postdocs or PhD or tenure track or permanent positions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to connect you. I think they are both amazing people and researchers. So I want to advocate for them as much as I can. All right, so my entry point into all of this is through research on the built environment and health. And this is something that's really exploded over the last couple of decades. And I think a lot of this has to do with the ability of people to take data, and there's been this proliferation of data that has spatial attributes, and map it in all sorts of ways to understand who has access or who is exposed to what, and then link that to some outcome, in our case, health. And we've found some interesting things. There have been some interesting theories around access and exposure to green space, access and exposure to food, and to physical activity, and to car-oriented traffic, et cetera, to healthcare facilities, noise even. And all of this stuff has been mapped, essentially. Like, we map where the noise is, we map where the trees are, and we say, well, we think that might help understand depression, or it might help us understand obesity. And there have been just hundreds of papers in this area over the past few decades. Now, the issue with this type of research is that, of course, the outcomes are oftentimes inconsistent. And there's a lot of reason for that. In particular, the spatial scope of studies. So whether we're looking at a neighborhood, an entire city, a metro region, a country, there are issues with statistical power. It can be very difficult to get enough of a sample to say things definitively across geographic regions, issues with consistency in data collection, measurement, and also, of course, there's this other discipline called biology, and biologic and genetic effects, of course, are very important when it comes to health. And so we've had some issues, I'd say, as geographers trying to link the environment to these actual health outcomes that we're really interested in explaining. And my entry, or my sort of my particular area of expertise in the built environment and health area is related to food environments. And this sort of subfield within the built environment in research literature is very much it very much has the issues that I just described. There are a lot of inconsistencies in outcomes depending on the geography, depending on the spatial scale, the power, the way things are measured, et cetera. Now, the area of built environment and food environment research and its links to health really was probably one of the most exemplary sub areas that we saw lots of researchers contributing to over the last few decades. And I think this has to do with three things in particular. The first is that we did see relatively rapid shifts in food retail environments in the late 20th century, especially in North America. And this is illustrated very nicely in a paper by Larson and Gilliland from 2008, where they essentially mapped out where all the food stores were in 1961, and then again in the early 2000s, and we see essentially the suburbanization of this retail. Now that's related to all sorts of issues with supply chains and movements of populations and things like that. But that sort of geography, that new geography that we see, is essentially leading people to think about ideas like the food desert, which is a pretty problematic term in my opinion, but we see interest in understanding, well, what's happening here? Because at the same time in the 90s, we see the rise of the obesity epidemic, or at least the discussion around the obesity epidemic. We see pretty high increases in the rates of obesity across youth and adults from the start of the 90s into the late 90s. And this also corresponds with the third thing, which is the proliferation of GIS. And so in the 90s and early 2000s, of course, we see the commercialization of GIS software really changing the way that geographers and health researchers start to think about environmental data, and it becomes much easier to plot out the locations of stores and look to see how they relate to certain outcomes. Now, of course, we know that there are much more complex ways in which people interact with food retail, but I'll get into that in a slide or two. Now, the basic model when it comes to understanding the food environment and health link looks a little bit like this, where we think that if people have access or exposure to certain types of food retailers, that will impact their diet, and that impact on diet will then have some implication for health. The problem, of course, as I sort of alluded to earlier on, is that what do we mean by access? That's a very complicated concept. There are all sorts of other things that lead into shifts in diet and different qualities of diet. And then again, at the end of this model, we see all sorts of other stuff like biology and genetics impacting our health outcomes. So some people could, in theory, probably eat McDonald's every day of their life and live the same as far as well-being and health as somebody who never eats McDonald's in their life because of particular genetic factors that those two people maybe don't share. Now, that's not to say that at the population level, we would see the same thing, but these are considerations that I think we need to be thinking about a bit more seriously in our line of work. So when we think about the complexities of access, I think one of the issues that we tend not to do as geographers is kind of complicate this idea a bit. So we tend to think about access spatially, because we're geographers for the most part. And of course, access is multidimensional. In the public health space, there's quite a bit of work that's been done to unpack that. But when we think specifically about the link between an individual and their access to food outlets, there are all these other things that come into play, like financial access, economic access, what kind of transportation they're using. So it's easier perhaps to take a car to a suburban supermarket to buy lots of groceries than it would be to take a bus. What sort of cooking facilities are at home, what family dynamics are at play, and of particular interest to me, what sort of time constraints may be playing into the decisions and behaviors a person partakes in as they relate to food. So in thinking about all of this, I started to want to explore the role that geographers can play in taking a slightly more nuanced approach to the food environment and understanding how the food environment impacts our health, our diets, and ultimately our well-being. So one area that I kept coming back to throughout, exploring and thinking about all of this built environment and health research was that individual interactions with the built environment and the food environment in particular are quite dynamic, and they're very much contextualized by social and economic factors. And so I started to think that a person's geography and time use in particular are inextricably linked. So when we start thinking about what decisions a person makes related to their food, so what store they go to, what food they buy, etc., that's very much related to the time they have to make the trip, to make the food, to clean up afterwards, and how it's linked to their sort of social network at their household. So I was thinking, maybe as geographers, what we can do is go back to these ideas here, money, transportation, etc., and start to link not only the space, the geographies of these different dimensions that impact our use of food environments, but also think about the temporal dimension in addition, because those two things are very much linked, the spatial and the temporal. I think that's probably an argument most of you would agree with. But the idea here is that the time we spend on food activities impacts our diet, and then conversely, the types of diets that we are eating, our dietary practices are going to influence the amount of time we spend on certain types of food-related behaviors. Now, this is coming at a time, of course, where we've seen this new wave of data enter the sphere of research. We have all sorts of new opportunities to think about dynamic spatial information, so spatiotemporal analyses have really hit their stride, and we see lots of really great work being done with trajectory information and other types of dynamic spatial data. But I wanted to think how we could use this information in a way that accounted for some of the other things that are going on in the background, not just that sort of simple access exposure dynamic, but also some of the temporal constraints that might be playing out at home, and how the geography of the food environment goes beyond just somebody's ability to go to a supermarket, for example. So this kind of led me back to a theory which many of you probably know, really developed by folks like Hagerstrand, Lintorp, Kastelgaard. These folks have spent a lot of time thinking very carefully about time geography, and in fact, at some points, they engaged in food-related behaviors in their research. But this is maybe the wrong slide for this audience, since most of you are experts in the field of geography, so you probably know about time geography. But essentially, time geography was hoping to sort of extend upon contemporary at the time uses of time use data, and think about how flows across space and the context of those spatial activities changed over time, and how they were sort of related in a feedback loop to each other. So how you moved impact the amount of time you spent at certain activities, and the amount of time you spent at certain activities impacts how you move. Now, of course, the time geography field tends to use this more disaggregated use of time data where we're looking at the flows of activities and not the aggregate, though both can be useful. Now, there's a really good paper by Bo Lenthorpe that was published in the early 2000s that sort of breaks down time geography. And I apologize if this is sort of information you all already know, but it essentially highlights sort of the four major components of the theory. The first two are trajectories and prisms. We're probably mostly familiar with these things, but essentially trajectories, we can kind of think of those like GPS data. We have these spatiotemporal trajectories, and this is the realized geography of a person essentially. And people have begun to use this type of information in research related to food activities. So here's an example from our group where we were looking at the amount of time spent at different places using a time-weighted activity space measure to understand exposure to fast food outlets and look at how that related to use of different fast food retailers amongst a cohort of young adults in Canada. Now, this is very useful information. There's some really great things we can do with this. And in fact, there's a lot of really good work in the trajectory space being done right now. But of course, there are plenty of limitations. There's this issue in food environment literature in particular of the selective mobility bias. So people who go to shop for groceries at a supermarket have exposure to supermarkets. It's sort of a selectivity bias that we have to account for. And it may not necessarily reflect the sort of average exposure a person might have throughout the course of a day or a week or a month. Collecting these data can be costly, though it is getting cheaper with everyone having cell phones now with GPS chips in them. There are some reliability issues. On the right, we see a GPS trajectory data set collected from myself. This is when I lived right downtown. And, it gives a general sense of where I'm going, but this downtown section right here is, of course, a bit of a mess. And so understanding whether I'm at the office building on one street or the supermarket next door to it is not particularly easy to discern with this type of information. Though there are ways of getting around it, but again, we're just kind of having to spend more resources, time, energy, and effort developing technologies that allow us to get more precise information. So maybe we can think of other ways to use the technology we have now to do that. Now, probably most importantly, the issue with the trajectory information and the work in the food environment literature that uses trajectory information is that it's devoid of context. So why a person went to a certain location or some other location, in many cases, we don't really know. We don't understand what the motivation was, what were the constraints, what was the sort of reasoning behind the trip. And that really will lead to lots of sad cats. And so this is a cat that is sad. I had to work it in somehow, I'm sorry. All right, enough of that awesome joke. So on to prisms, of course, trajectories of the realized geographies of people over space and time. We have prisms, which are a great way to think about potential access and exposure. And what I like about this component of time geography is that we have constraints built in, so we can understand not only the spatial constraints and movement constraints, but coupling constraints. So whether or not you need to do a trip or an activity with a child who may be at a daycare center across the city. There's authority constraints. So if the food store is open or closed. So it helps us think a little bit more carefully about the other actors in the geography of the food environment. And there are other examples of research in this area that have used this concept. So we did a paper looking at transit, the impact of transit on the potential to interact with supermarkets in Cincinnati. And what we essentially found was that when we account for movements of people who use transit, their accessibility picture when it comes to potential places they could go shop for food looks very different than what the USDA, which is the US Department of Agriculture, their measure of food deserts look like in the same city. So the red zones here are the food deserts, as the USDA called them, and the darker shaded zones are areas that have lower access for transit users in the city of Cincinnati. So again, this was a nice exercise, but we're still missing some context. And so these are still naive approaches to a behavioral dynamic that's pretty complicated, because what we choose to eat really doesn't come down to what food store is near to us. That's sort of getting into this neo-determinism of health geography, which I really think we should avoid, and which I think personally, maybe this is a controversial statement, that quantitative geographers are getting a little bit too close to these days. And I think we need to start thinking a bit more carefully about the geography of behaviors and why they're occurring in certain locations and what the other factors are that are sort of inspiring those behaviors at certain places. Now, the question then is, Michael, you're talking about time geography. So how does that relate to what you're thinking about now? So that leads me to the other two areas of time geography that Lentor writes about in his paper from 2004, which are sort of summaries of ideas that came out of work done by Hagerstrand and others. And those are pockets of local order and projects. And so these two things, these are kind of deep cuts in the time geography literature. They're not particularly common, I think, because they're kind of a pain to actually use in an empirical setting. So pockets of local order are essentially this idea that we need all the things to come together in space and time for a particular aim or goal to be achieved. And then a project kind of extends this idea where you have a sequence of pockets of local order where behaviors or activities occur that lead up to some bigger goal that a person might be interested in achieving. So for example, you could have a project of eating healthy food, and that project would involve lots of different activities, each of which has some temporal and spatial component to it, and an important sort of geographic dimension that you may need to consider in leading up to the goal of eating healthy food. Now you can expand this in different ways and think about it at different scales. So you could take this idea and move it from eating a healthy meal to being a healthy person. And of course, you can see how it gets a bit more challenging to sort of put piece together in a way that can be tested, that we can use and collect data on and publish in journals, for example. Now, humor me for a second. I want to just quickly jump to another dimension and talk a bit about time use before I get into the actual work that we've done, where we've brought together these concepts of time geography and time use and trajectory information, and just acknowledge that there's been quite a bit of literature on how time use does influence the ways people prepare food, the types of food that they do eat, and how that impacts downstream impacts on health. And so with some work we did in Canada here, we found that the amount of time spent on meal preparation was pretty significantly linked to feelings of time pressure. We also found more time spent on meal prep was associated with less stress and better mental health. But we did see some pretty significant differences in how those variables played out when we started to stratify by people who had lower ratings of self-rated health or higher ratings of self-rated health. So essentially, we started to see that stratifying by different feelings of time pressure, different feelings of health. We started to see different breakdowns of the sequences of activities that led up to meal preparation, and then the amount of time they spent on food-related behaviors. And so the point of this slide is essentially to say that we know, and there is a pretty deep literature here, that time use matters when it comes to diet, nutrition, and health. But the thing we don't know is then how our time use impacts the spaces of our food-related behaviors, and how our food-related behaviors impact our time use. And that sort of dynamic is what I was really hoping to get at in bringing in these ideas of time geography with the food activities, socioeconomics, transportation, and time use study, the FAST study. Now, this is a study that we began in 2017, and thankfully we completed data collection in 2019 before the pandemic, so we were able to get most of our data collected and ready to go by the start of COVID. So we weren't impacted by that. However, I just want to acknowledge that some of this stuff could be shifting given the current pandemic conditions. So in this study, what we aimed to do was take this time use data that lacked spatial context and trajectory data, which lacked context around a person's social, economic, and sort of temporal context, and kind of merge these two things together. And the aim was then to explore how those things impacted the divisions of household labor, dietary behaviors, and spatial variations in time use and things related to care and other important household activities. So the study focused on 3 neighborhoods. The idea was to look at high transit accessible neighborhoods with high access to food retail, low transit accessibility, low food retail accessibility, and then another neighborhood with low transit accessibility and high food retail accessibility. We kind of struck out in the eastern neighborhood here with low transit but good food access. So most of our sample is up here in the northwest portion of Toronto and down here in South Parkdale, which has really great transit access and food retail access. Now, I have to note that our sample is not great. It was a very big challenge working to get a good sample for this project. We were aiming to collect data on lower to lower income individuals. We wanted to collect data on paired parents or single parents only. So we wanted to make sure we got representatives of all the adult members of the household in our sample so that we could pair their activities together. By chance, the sample we got only contains male-female partners. We had higher rates in rec scale of completion. There's all sorts of nuances to the data. This is all to say, we don't have a properly powered sample. However, we can still use this information to, I think, explore some of the concepts that I've been thinking about over the last couple of years. So hopefully the sample doesn't ruin it for all of you. I'm happy to talk to you more about what I learned in doing this data collection down the line, but just want to put that out there up front, so I'm not, you don't think I'm pulling any fast things on you guys here. So the data collection did include 3 main components. There was a survey, lots of questions about socioeconomic status, dietary patterns, health, self-rated health, use of transportation. We had a GPS and dietary questionnaire. So essentially folks had an app on their phone, and that phone collected GPS data for a week. And they answered 2 questions about their meals per day. And then we had a self-reported time use diary, which was filled out at least a couple of times a day. And it was based off of the harmonized European time use survey. So that looked a little bit like this. So folks had a paper diary, which they'd fill out. We asked them to fill it out at their lunchtime and in the evening. And essentially they'd say, well, I woke up, I did this activity, I did this other activity. And then if they were doing an activity for a long period of time, they could just draw an arrow straight down. There's contextual information on the side here that was filled out to different levels of quality for different participants, but we got pretty good primary activity and location and transport mode information from our participants. Trajectory data, you've probably all seen this. It closely aligns with the 2 areas that we were sampling, so Rexdale in the northwest and Parkdale down here, with a bit of a cluster in downtown Toronto where a lot of business activity occurs, so a lot of jobs are probably happening. And so we, at this point, want to essentially take all this information and do something useful with it. And so what I'll do now is kind of turn to 2 different parts of our analysis. The first is related to the geography of households and the division of labor. And like I said earlier, the design of the study was really meant to understand how household labor and the division of that labor impacts things like the types of food you eat, how often you eat, when you have dinner, how long you have dinner for, etc. And so we were able to take the time use data, which looked like this as a sequence, and we compare the two parents, because if you recall, we collected data on two parents in most cases, and sometimes we had a single parent. And we could look at how their activities corresponded to each other, but then we could also play that out across space because we have the GPS data also available to us. So we could link the time that they were doing certain activities to the locations that those activities occurred in. Now, one of the first things we wanted to do, because we realized our sample is small, was just to sort of prove a point. And not many studies have paired data of all the adults in a household. And one of the things that we kept on noticing was that a lot of studies tend to ask the question, are you the primary food shopper for your household? Or don't even do that. They just sample one person from a household and look at maybe what exposure they have to different types of food environments. And they assign that level of food environment exposure back to the household and say something about what that means for the diet and nutrition of that particular household. So we wanted to ask with this data set what the implications are of using trajectory data of only one household member to calculate exposure scores or access scores if the task is or can be completed by multiple household members. So essentially we're saying, eating is oftentimes a household level activity, and by leaving out one member who is actively engaged in that, even if they aren't the primary member of partaking in the activity, we could be missing some important information. So who's doing the shopping and when does it matter? So our design looked a little bit like this. We essentially have we have adults in our households, and we are looking to see whether or not the different exposures they have is sort of about the same, if we're seeing significant differences for the women participants versus the men, if we're seeing differences within household or across the whole sample. And because of the sort of all the stuff I want to cover, I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights. What we see is that leaving out individuals in a household with multiple shoppers does result in missing a very significant number of exposures, and it's gendered. Men appear to make up most of the household activity space, so they tend to have the bigger regions in which they're traveling, but women's activity spaces typically have greater food retail density. So women are, in our sample at least, the ones that are nearer to the food retailers than the men are, but the men tend to have these bigger regions in general. And that's especially true for supermarkets. So comparing men and women in the same household, we did also see that the density of supermarkets are greater for women across all measures. So it's not just the counts, but it's also the density across the spaces in which they're traveling, which makes a bit of sense given the bigger activity sizes of the men. But we thought this was an important piece that, hopefully will contribute to the food environment literature. This was published in the Annals earlier this year. So if you'd like more information on what we did there, the citations in the bottom. Now, a second project in this realm, in this part, is something we're working on at the moment. So this isn't complete, but we took a bit more of an aspatial approach with the data and asked, is the time allocated for non-food related activities associated with the total time spent on and division of food-related housework within partnered households? So essentially, if one partner is spending more time on food-related activities, is that compensating for their other partner, or is there some level of fixity or inelasticity in how these things play out across the population in our sample? And what we essentially see is women, in this case, in our sample, it's again very gendered. We see men are doing more work, especially out of home, women are doing more food-related housework and caregiving, and recreation at home is about the same. That's sort of just the descriptive statistics of what we're seeing. But what we find when we throw this into a mixed effects model is that women tend to adjust the time they spend on food work to accommodate for men's higher duration of out-of-home work. So if they're reporting work in their time use diary and we see in the GPS data that they're outside of their neighborhood, we see women are essentially adjusting the amount of chores they're doing related to food at home. However, that's not reciprocated. So men generally don't increase their involvement in food work if their female partner's time commitment to non-food related activities goes up. So this is getting into sort of ideas around different attitudes related to food and food chores and the sort of gender nature of all of this. So this is work in progress. We're hoping to sort of incorporate a more geographic aspect to it in the near future here. All right, part two. I'm kind of going along pretty quickly here. I apologize. I hope it's not too fast. This paper is the one where we bring everything together. So here, what we wanted to ask was, how does time use affect food-related behaviors, and how do built environments impact time use? So we wanted to find an approach that allowed us to use the time use data and the trajectory data in conjunction, so together, to understand the ways that impacted different types of food-related behaviors. So we wanted to link the diary with the trajectory information and find patterns across both dimensions. Now, the way that we figured we could do this was with a method called multi-channel optimal matching, or multiple channel sequence analysis. What this method does is it essentially looks for similarities in patterns of sequences. And the multi-channel component of it is essentially saying you can have multiple channels of sequences. So one can be a sequence of time use and the other can be a sequence of geography. There was some nice work done by, I believe it was Jed Long and Erska Demsar, who looked at weather and movement. But here we're trying to incorporate the actual activities and the behaviors of a person with their movement, and not some sequence of some other external factors. So it's sort of the endogenous behavior that we're interested in here. So the basic workflow was using the Needleman-Wunsch algorithm to compare the sequences. So each individual has a geography sequence and time use sequence. And we want to compare that individual to all other individuals. And then we did a clustering using Ward's method to group our participants into 5 categories. So the data look like this. Raw, we've got a bunch of participants with their sequences of activities. Colors represent different types of activities. And we've got trajectory information. We smoosh this together and we use, I don't know if I want to go into the math here, but essentially we're looking at the distances between our sequences. So if it takes a lot, if 2 individuals do the same sequence of activities in a day, there'll be no distance between those 2 people. However, if there's 1 or 2 activities that differ, there'll be a very small distance between those 2 individuals. If they do completely opposite things in completely opposite places, then we'll see a very big distance. And so we're essentially just trying to measure how far apart these sequences are from each other using this, this approach here. Now, the time use data was pretty straightforward to represent as a sequence because that's its sort of natural form. We have sequences of activities over time. Those time use diaries we digitized, and we have 10-minute resolution for activities across our 7-day study period. Now, the geography element was a little trickier. We tried a couple of things, but we ended up settling on sort of descriptive notions of geography. So essentially here in this B column, we see time use. So we have activities colored by different activity types. So dark gray is work, dark green is caregiving, light green is non-food related chores, etc. But over here, we have a number of sequences based on proximity to their residential location. So how far away they are from home. So light gray is they're at home, medium gray is they're in the neighborhood, and dark gray is they're far away from their home. We have additional spatial context with a sequence of whether or not you are near within, I believe we used 0.5 kilometer of a supermarket and grocery store. So that means that at home, they could be near a grocery store or not. And then they could be near a grocery store or not as they move around the city throughout the day. And then we move all this stuff together into this final sequence, which is essentially the various different possible types of states a person can be in. So this legend here for E is essentially combining whether or not, what type of activity they were doing, how far away from home they were, and whether or not they had access to a food retailer. And the idea here is that we're able to sort of link together some of that context in a way that's a bit more nuanced than what we've seen in past food environment research. So we do this, we run it through the algorithm, we do our clustering, and we get a bunch of clusters. In this case, I apologize, I said 5 clusters, I meant 6. This is one way to visualize the data, but perhaps an easier way to look at it is looking at the distributions of the sequences. On the left here, we've got a weekly sequence. So we looked at it at a weekly time scale. And on the right, we looked at a daily time scale, just to account for the fact that we have weekends and weekdays and things like that. On the farthest left here, we've got activities, so types of activities that were being done across time. And then right here, the second column are those locations. So if they're at home without a grocery store, that's light blue. If they're at home with a grocery store, that's a light yellow. If they're in their neighborhood, it's sort of a grayish blue and a darker yellow. And I won't get into each of these categories, it's kind of a lot, but essentially what we ultimately get are groups of people who have similar spatial patterns and patterns of activities. For example, this WP2, these are people who don't go to work. They don't work for a paid job. However, they do a lot of work when it comes to caregiving. So we see dark green is caregiving activities. So throughout the week, they're doing lots of chores and caregiving. And their location channel here, we see lots of being at home, essentially, without access to a grocery store in this case. There's sort of a parallel group down here, WP5, where we see lots of caregiving activities, perhaps a bit more work, but at home, they have access to a grocery store. So we're able to kind of separate out these two types of individuals and what their food environment looks like given their activity patterns and their trajectories. All right, hopefully that was not too all over the place. So we are doing an exploratory analysis, again, acknowledging that our sample is quirky and has all sorts of limitations. We find some things that are not perhaps all that surprising, like doing less paid work means more food-related chores. We did see that evening workers, so people who do paid work at night, tend to spend less time on food chores and shopping, which is an interesting finding. There's an interesting line of work around shift workers and their dietary patterns. And there's some, essentially, we see higher rates of food-related disease amongst that population. So that is an interesting finding, I think, from our end. Workers with food retail access near home showed more food shopping activities. This kind of corresponds to that earlier paper I talked about where we tended to see the gendered activity spaces, more women spending time around food retail outlets and tending to be closer to home. And activity spaces that were close to home were linked to more food shopping. So that story is becoming a little bit clearer, at least amongst our sample. So again, as you see, I have my take this with a grain of salt. We just want to sort of show that this approach could be a way to deal with some of the limitations of traditional food environment analysis that are out there. Now, if you're interested in this paper, I think the citation is down here at the bottom. This was recently published in Geographical Analysis and with Bochu Liu, my PhD student, leading the paper. So a quick nod, because I want to leave time for questions here, discussion, rather, I probably prefer discussion. We do have this ongoing work with Care and Caring, led by Lindsay Smith. And essentially she's asking, how do trips related to Care and Caring impact time use on other things like food, preparation and shopping, as well as spatial patterns? And so are we seeing essentially a spatial disadvantage play out for populations that are in more suburban regions who maybe have to travel further to deliver children to school or to daycare than we see with people who live downtown, maybe have more access to transit, for example. And we've got about 400 trips made for care with 59 individuals from 45 households doing this activity. And again, we're seeing this gendered pattern show up. Essentially, women are spending more time on care, as has been noted previously, but also their care-related travel times are much higher than their male counterparts, their male partners. And we've started to sort of break these trips out into different typologies. So we have sort of out and back trips. We have different types of trip chaining where there's maybe dropping the kid off at school and then going to buy some groceries and then coming home. And then we have essentially, we're calling these drive-by care trips where you maybe do something with a child for care-related reason and then go off to work. So maybe you drop the kid off at school and then spend lots of time at your work location next. So this is all very preliminary. I look forward to this being developed out over the next couple months, and hopefully at the AAG we can talk more about it. I think we'll have that work done by then. So where to next? More detailed descriptions of the built environment, I think, are needed on our part. As I noted, we're still doing some of the stuff that I kind of critiqued early on, just looking at basic, are you near this place and not at use? And that's partially due to some of the limitations in our data. But I think we're getting a little bit closer to that goal than previous work. So that's something we're continuing to work on, and I, of course, welcome suggestions from the crowd. Now, I do think that there are opportunities to use theories and methods from time geography and quantitative health research in a way that's a bit more, well, I think that time geography has something to offer still, especially when it comes to the idea of projects. And this is something we're kind of working through right now, both you and I, around how we can conceptualize what a project is as it relates to the geography of some health outcome, and not just thinking about the act of going nearby a supermarket and that making your chances of buying food there more, higher or not. What are the geographies of your food preparation? What are the geographies of your relationship to others in your household? And I think this can also be something we can do in other areas of health geography, like physical activity, mental health, and care and caring, which we're starting to dive into now. Finally, I'll just say that I do think that ultimately there was a missed opportunity here and we didn't interview any of our participants. This is where mixed methods could have really helped us understand a bit more about what we're seeing in our data. We are working with members of the community in Rexdale to sort of design next steps for this project. And so they've been a great partner throughout the entire process. And hopefully we'll start to incorporate some of this stuff going forward. So I'll stop there. Again, I'd really like to thank Lindsay Smith and Bochi Liu. They've been amazing collaborators in this project. And of course, thanks to funders. And you can follow me on Twitter here if you like, or not. You can just you can lurk in the background if you prefer, or shoot me an email if you have questions at my email address here. With that, I will end, and I'm happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was great. So we look forward to your questions and your comments. There's one question that I think you partially just answered right now, but from Jonathan Olson, who says, thanks for the great presentation. And I wondered if you had collected any information, possibly qualitative, to understand why these choices are being made.
No, I wish we had. I think it was an incredibly burdensome data collection process already for the participants. And so doing the daily time use diaries So typically when you do a time use diary, you do 1 day, or maybe you do 3 days, like a weekend and a weekday. And we asked them to do it for 7 days. We had a pretty high compensation or incentive to do this work, but I think this is part of the reason why our sample was so small. We did have funds to get many more people, but we just couldn't recruit individuals into the study. So I think we were a little overwhelmed with just doing the combination of these two things. And if I were to go back in time and do it again, I would definitely integrate an interview component of a subsample of the population. And I really think that's maybe my next project or somebody else's next project, because I think that will give us a lot more. We can infer. So with the trajectory information, we're just guessing about motivation. With time use information, we can make inferences, we can guess a little bit, we can have smarter guesses about why a person traveled from location A to location B if we see that they are then picking up a child and coming home. But to really know why a person made the choice to go to that location or this location, we need to ask them, right? So it's a great question, though.
Well, we have another question from Tuli Toivonen, who asks, well, first she says, thanks for a fantastic presentation, Michael. A more general level question. You mentioned in a side sentence that quantitative geographers should be less closed. And then she says, did I hear that right? Do you mean there's a need for more use of mixed methods or something else? Could you please elaborate on your thinking on the role of quantitative geography and health studies from this perspective? And
Right.
it'd be great to see you at AAG.
Yeah, no, so that's a really good question. So what I said was, it was referencing, so there's a line of research, and I think this is important research, and I don't think there's anything wrong with this research, but we've been really taking advantage of all the big data that are out there. We see lots of analyses where we've got thousands, tens of thousands, or more of movement trajectories of individuals, thanks to cell phone data, basically through tower information and things like that. And we can start to see these movement patterns. But I think where I'm a little hesitant is that those movement patterns at population levels can give us some interesting insights around, how does certain levels of movement impact certain outcomes. But I don't think it gives us the ability to necessarily think about more complicated types of health behaviors, like food-related behaviors, I would argue, because there are so many different components, and that while we can see all these people have access or don't have access, and we have population level essentially information around how people are moving. We're not seeing their connection to their partners. We're not seeing the connections to children. We're not seeing the connection to how much time they actually have to make a decision to make a frozen meal or cook a meal from scratch. And so I think my point was more that we need to have a bit more nuance when it comes to thinking about the mechanisms of what mechanisms of geography impact actual outcomes in health. I'm not sure if that makes sense. I wish that Tuli could talk to me, because then I'm sure we would go back and forth on this, but maybe at AAG Tuli will, yeah.
It makes me wonder though, I mean, we're not at the end all be all of either data or methods, right? Of course, there's lots of evolution. And right now we live in a particular time period with a particular kind of data and methodological set of innovations. And I guess what you're saying is that we just aren't quite there yet. I mean, it's talking to people, but it's also better data and better methods that sort of help us really get at how we believe actual behaviors are structured and what influences them. And I would completely agree that with a lot of the sort of bigger data we've got, we can't answer the kinds of questions that we want to be able to.
But I think it's worth exploring because, so for example, in the study where we looked at, how do partners' exposures to food retailers differ? If they didn't differ that much, then, and this is a study that we probably need to do at a bigger scale with more people. if they don't differ that much, then it doesn't matter who we pick. And then we can do like simpler analyses. And so then some of those bigger data approaches might be appropriate. But I think we need to sort of get into the smaller, I think there's a guy, maybe some of you know him, Juan Antonio in Chile, who essentially calls it boutique data science, what he does, because he tends to have small data sets like I do. And so I like to say that this boutique data science is actually, it contributes in the sense that it allows us to really tease out maybe what dynamics are important, which ones aren't. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure we know yet, and I think you're right, Rachel, that we're at a particular moment where there's all these new toys, and we want to play with the new toys, and we should do that. And but understand that, you know, of course, there are limitations to both of these things.
Yeah, Levi, did you have a question for Michael?
Just more of a remark about, you know, the data is interesting, and I think the tension you're talking about is a really interesting kind of issue with replication, right? That you have concepts and preliminary findings from small sample data that you wanted to look into the qualitative version of, and you might be able to, you know, power up in these larger samples. But you mentioned the word mechanism, right? And a causal association is only identified if you have both a mechanism and the estimate. Yeah. So speaking a little bit more about the mechanism then, which is a theoretical relationship between the entities in your study, how do you think that you might be able to kind of get at what the mechanism is for the causal associations you're studying? Is there a way that you see as being promising, or is it just kind of?
Yeah, no, I think that's a hard question.
Because it's theoretical, right? The mechanism exists independent of its measurement.
Yeah, it's very important. It's a very important question. Yeah, it exists independently. I do think that this approach has potential. I am, now that I've gone through it, I am more skeptical though that it will be feasible to get the data to actually dig in and, you know, go beyond the effect and get into the actual causal relationships that you're kind of talking about. Because at least right now, it's very difficult to get the activity information and link it to the trajectory information. The trajectory information is pretty easy to get now. The activity information is very difficult. The only way to automate that in a way that maybe is more efficient is you get into really creepy situations, right? Where you're like observing a person through a camera, or like, there's all sorts of things that I'm not sure that we even really want to get into. So it may not be ethical to then use this at the scale that we would need to actually uncover mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So I don't have an answer, I guess, to that. I just have thoughts.
Sure.
That are maybe unsatisfied.
Well, I think that's good. I think it's good to end on thoughts as well as answers. I'm going to turn the floor over to Levi before we say goodbye for a little announcement.
Sure, yes. So thank you very much for joining us today at our inaugural SAD seminar talk. To inform you all, there are multiple different kinds of events all underneath the SAD umbrella. Seminars are just one. We might have a panel later in the year as another, but I want to invite you explicitly to keep an eye out for the next SAD interview, which is a sort of a dialogue, conversation between myself, Rachel, our colleague Danielle Arabispel, and then it will be Sabrina Fabricant. We'll be having the interview on the 16th of November at 4 p.m. London. So past interviews have included people like Mike Batty, Luke Anslin, Helen Kuklelis, Alison Heppenstall, and most recently, Danny Dorling. So we hope that you're able to join us on November 16th at 4 p.m. London for our interview with Professor Fabricant. So thank you very much for coming today, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Yes, thank you to everyone. Thank you so much, Michael, for an excellent talk. And yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
Bye, folks.